It is 5 o'clock, so we can officially start our meeting. I welcome you to this event organized in cooperation of two universities, the University of Latvia and the University of Pretoria. My name, as you can also read on my screen, is Dace Balode, and I am Dean of the Faculty of Theology of University of Latvia. Thanks to all for joining us tonight. As we see here are people from many countries all over the world, as far as I understand, and I saw there are somebody also from Latvia and from South Africa probably as well. And yes,
quite a few.
Quite a few, yeah. And usually we would have the same time, but since Latvia switched to summertime, so we have now different time, as far as I understand. We have 5 o'clock here in Riga and 6 o'clock actually in Pretoria. Is it so?
No, 4
No?
o'clock.
4 o'clock. Oh,
yes.
Yes, okay.
You are more advanced than me.
Oh. Hmm? Okay.
You are more advanced than me.
No. Yes.
I see Yvette sitting in, I suppose, deep, dark USA in San Diego. No, not. Early morning.
Maybe somebody can yes, also represent the time.
June Boyce-Tillman has joined us from the UK.
Okay.
June, I apologize, but I will be referring to your work.
But we are happy, so neither the time nor place is hindering us to connect with each other. So we are we can find or we can meet each other in the same time in the same place anywhere. Wherever we are. That's a good. That's a good. Yeah, through some struggles of the last time, but not to speak a lot or too much now in the beginning. So I would like to introduce also to our schedule today. Let's say we will have an hour together. So first we are going to listen to lecture, and then afterwards we will have some time for discussion, for questions and comments. But please feel free to put the questions in the Zoom's chat anytime, so we can or Kristo can answer them later than after finishing his lecture. And after the lecture, you are also kindly invited to switch on your microphone and ask or comment whatever you want. So, but with pleasure, I would like to introduce to you today's speaker, Professor Christo Lombaard. For sure, some of you know him already. He's head of Department of Practical Theology and Mission Studies in University of Pretoria, and his academic interests lie in the field of spirituality studies, Bible exegesis, especially Old Testament studies, and also journalism, which was his first academic education. He's author of numerous articles and books in these fields. And by the way, you can easily find some of them in his as open access articles listed on the webpage of Department of Practical Theology and Mission Studies. So the last article I read just yesterday from Christo Lombaard was about mystagogy as methods in biblical spirituality, which I find very interesting regarding the biblical hermeneutics he explains in this article. And he has also one article published in Latvian.
That's true.
It is proof of the long time cooperation we have between Kristo Lombaard and the Faculty of Theology. And I just tried to reconstruct today how long actually this cooperation is. And I found that the first email exchange is 2013. So it's quite a long time. And we are very, very happy about that. So, but now the floor is yours, Kristo. So please introduce us to such a complicated, big issue, new, I don't know, and very old at the same time to spirituality.
Thank you very much, Tatse. My thanks to you for arranging this. My thanks also to colleague Ilse for making the technical arrangements for this meeting. The single article of mine published in Latvian was not my own language abilities, but Ilse Jansone, who's amongst the group here, she did the difficult translation work, for which I still thank her dearly. And I, in fact, refer to that volume today, not to my article in it. I remember one of my first lectures at University Latvia. It was in a classroom. I was a little bit uncomfortable, it was new. Afterwards, I was told to go to the dean's office. Of course, I felt immediately in trouble. Yvette will remember, in the kind of school that we went to, if you were sent to the head's office, that always meant something bad. I arrived there and there was a table of alcohol. We had to drink shots. So I realized in Latvia, theology is practiced rather more lively than in the South African tradition. So I appreciate the action very much. Thank you. There is a handout, that means a PDF document, which Ilse she already put it on the chat group. If you just want to listen, that's fine. Some of my sentences tend to be a little technical, for which I always apologize and I never manage to fix. So if you want to read along, you are most welcome to do that. And then questions, as Datse said, afterwards. But the topic you have, so I won't repeat that, and the little aphorism, I will leave that out as well, but I will start with a prelude. One is doomed to failure if you have to speak about the unsayable in a way that is understandable, yet somehow intellectually respectable. Your colleagues shouldn't laugh at you. I shall try. Again, like Sisyphus in the ancient Greek myth. We, however, all know where roads paved with good intentions lead to. French philosopher Sartre would say to other people. Afrikaans philosopher Dani Goosen would say to communication. Yet I admit that I somewhat twist their intentions, by which I hope to say as little as possible. Silence is always more spiritual. Time, music, whiskey and vodka. Spirituality is, in a sense, like time, like music, like whiskey and vodka. On time, St. Augustine had already written in the 5th century, and not without a hint of humor, he wrote, "What then is time? If nobody asks me, I know. But if I have to explain it, I do not know." It is much the same with spirituality. We can use the concept spontaneously and have a fair sense of shared meaning. However, the moment we have to specify our intentions when using this term, spirituality, we enter, as it were, a cloud of unknowing. Spirituality and music are in various ways related. Phenomenologically, in close parallel, they are better experienced than described. Try to put to words what music is. Imagine speaking to somebody who has never heard music. Try telling them what music is. Music and spirituality are both difficult to describe. What is this in words? Not because they do not exist, as perhaps modernist science will have it, but because they seem to extend ourselves, our awareness, our sense of living to something beyond us, yet in us, yet shared amongst us. Both music and spirituality do that. I referred in the end note to June Boy-Stillman, who's with us here, and the series that she edits on a book series on precisely music and spirituality, precisely because of these phenomenological parallels. Then, back to the alcohol, it seems, the names of both whiskey and vodka refer to water. Whiskey in classical Gaelic and voda in Slavic languages. In Latvia, you have the Russian influence, which would be vodka, a little water, despite their etymological links, and that both mostly consist of H2O and C2H5OH. We all know that they are not the same drink. Even less so when mixed in cocktails, yet both are spirits, one meaning, that can leave our spirits, second meaning, lifted or flagged, including in conversations that are decidedly spirited. These liquids are not the same in some respects, yet are not much different from one another, viewed from another angle, as are spiritualities, not unrelated, not identical. Both spiritualities and these liquids can cleanse the soul. Both can be intoxicating, enslaving, enlivening water or sludge to draw in, to drown in. And the latter seems to be quite difficult within spirituality circles. This critical dimension of what is poor or bad or harmful spirituality is often overlooked when people write about spirituality, opting always for the meaningful and the deep or the elevating. This just as an aside. With these three simple, diverse parallels, time, music, fire, water, I try to say that spirituality is difficult to talk about. Not because it is so far removed from us, but the opposite. Spiritualities are intimately, reflexively sensed and absorbed by us, transformed in us, and is transformational of us, and then is lived and expressed completely naturally, usually intuitively. Seldom that people speak about it in this way. It is difficult to talk of such a primary sense of being in the abstract. I title the next section, So Close, Yet So Far Away. Nothing that is so close to us can be conveyed well in words. An example may illustrate this. When kissing a loved one or a religious icon, and the church tradition in which I grew up in Calvinism, that would be very strange to kiss an icon. But for instance, in an Orthodox tradition, it is nothing strange to see burly men, young teenage boys, along with women as well, kissing the religious icon. The example is when kissing a loved one or a religious icon. How can you tell another person about it in such a way that they experience that sensation too? How can they, at a distance with place and time and words in between, relive the event in order to understand fully the touch that you felt? All primary sensations of life taste, movement, love, and more, resist, firm definition. By telling you the hexadecimal numbers #008000, I show you or convey to you agreed on HTML code. But I show you the code only, and you see nothing yet of what I try to convey to you. When I go a step further and I tell you its more usual name, green, you now have an idea, but from memory and mental images, of what I refer to, but nothing more than an idea. Only by directly seeing this color, as you look at it now, can you know this is the color, authentically, the color. Neither by hash and the numbers, nor by the word green can anybody convey to you so that you experience the color. Each representation, whether by words or by numbers, means hiding the color, making it absent. Only if I no longer see, and in spirituality studies we often use the term unsee, so only if I unsee, look past, don't notice the scribbles and the quibbles with which we communicate, can I sense immediately, unmediatedly, this color that you look at now. Paradoxically, who or what we are most intimately familiar with, and more personally, who or what we are most familiarly, we can describe that least well. No different with spirituality. It is here that the academic discipline of spirituality studies stands firmest, in that it acknowledges outright its non-modernist current era, let's call it post-secular, methodological orientation. This field is self-implicatory. What is true of all fields of study, really, that the student or researcher is changed by the subject matter, that is openly acknowledged in spirituality studies as part of its identity. The older ideas and ideals of objectivity, long philosophically unmasked already in the 1960s by Thomas Kuhn, have never been claimed in a subject area where, for instance, humility is studied. How shall our humility be measured without destroying it? The moment one puts it in this way, then you realize if we compare our humility and in order to decide who is the most humble, it immediately destroys humility. And that is the value of spirituality. It doesn't have to do this measurement. It can do descriptive, it can be appreciative. To put it in another way, operationalizing, this is the language of empirical theology, operationalizing for the sake of empirical studies these primary sensations, virtues, and orientations to life into measurable concepts is both possible and interesting, yet existentially estranging. Such atomization of primary sensations render them so distant, even eerie, even weird, as to be unrelatable. To return to my kissing metaphor, I, for instance, do not kiss because of sensitive nerve endings or cultural conditioning on mating rituals or natural selection or socio-religious mores or because of pheromones. All of those are entirely valid analyses, don't get me wrong, but none in a way that matters to my experience in the moment of love and fervor. This then does not mean that my kiss or any other primary sensation does not exist, or that they now ought to disappear from what is accepted as modern or valid or valued, or that they lie beyond study. It means none of these things. It is precisely because such primary sensations are so near and dear to us that they are so hugely influential in how one sets up your life, how we construct our practices, and how we make sense of all of this: philosophical, metaphysical, transcendental, theological. We have been trained in our lifetime to look past these philosophical, metaphysical, transcendental, theological matters. But this sense-making, we always do it, even if we do not notice it, or if we were to disavow it, which often people try to do, for instance, with the ideology of objectivity. As English author Aldous Huxley had written almost a century ago already, he wrote, "It is impossible to live without a metaphysic. The choice that is given us by life," he means, "is not between some kind of metaphysic and no metaphysic. It is always between a good metaphysic and a bad metaphysic. That means a metaphysic that corresponds reasonably closely with observed and inferred reality, and one that doesn't." This quote from Huxley echoes one of the most ancient of Greek aphorisms known from us from the Ionian area in Greece, the philosopher called Thales. From the 7th to the 6th century BCE, he wrote, and we know only his writings via Aristotle. And one of his aphorisms was, "Everything is full of gods." Swinging that aphorism back through the centuries to our fringe position in history, this divine presence is on its part frequently in, for instance, and surprisingly perhaps, two of the most publicly a-religious countries of the world, in Estonia and the Czech Republic. Here, and I've heard it often, here count among the most frequent curses, respectively, Isam Humo or Jezus Christe. Was it G.K. Chesterton who wrote that no modern person curses by Zeus, implying that a verbal taboo only has resonance where some sense of the holy has been retained? Such an awareness does not have to be devout, it doesn't mean praying. But what Bailey had so productively termed implicit religion is present everywhere. Everything is reflexively full of spiritual impulses. Bailey had, from his doctorate, and further made the point that often people would say, there's, in the British context in particular, there's no religion, I'm not religious at all. Yet they would use constantly expressions such as, "I read my newspaper religiously." There's some kind of understanding of what religion would mean, the ritual that is involved. Or a rap star that would have, whose lyrics will be quite shocking in all respects, but hanging around the rap star's neck would be a very big ornamental cross. So there's something of religion implied, some remainder. It takes, for instance, if I can be forgiven very gruff characterizations for the moment, it takes, for instance, a Michel Foucault to show us that there is power in everything. It takes a Sigmund Freud to show us that there is sexuality in everything. It takes a Karl Marx to show us that there is money in everything, economy in everything. For the past roughly 2 decades, the theoreticians of the post-secular have again shown us that there is spirituality in everything. That means impulses from, or impulses of, religion, faith, belief, metaphysics, in everything. Please note that it is not as if we did not know that impulses from faith have influence all around us. One of the principal analyses in the humanities disciplines remains that of Max Weber on the specifically Protestant origins of capitalism. Maybe I should expand it a little bit. Weber's theory is that Protestants, because they felt that they are religiously saved, they had to live a life of gratefulness, of gratitude, and they do that by working hard. If you grew up in a Calvinist society like I did, you cannot help yourself. You think like that. What happens if you work hard? What happened with the early Dutch Calvinists when they work hard? They earned a lot of money. Now what do you do with the money? You have to put it someplace, you put it in a bank. What does the bank do with the money? They have to do something with it. They invest it in business. And there you have capitalism from Calvinism and from Lutheranism. And that is Max Weber's theory. As a parallel, a resurgence of scholarly interest is now evident these past 5 years or so on the insight by German jurist Karl Schmitt that no foundational political concept is without a legitimating religious mirror image. The case requires no argument that art has always been drenched in religious thematics, as is literature, as is music, from traditional first world and third world traditional music to classical music. It's unimaginable to think of classical music without religion, and rock music. I remember growing up being told that rock is anti-Christian, anti-religious. That's simply not true. If you listen to the lyrics to this day, the pop songs on what is these days the American Hot 100, anything between 30 and 50% at any given time would speak of Jesus or church or God or meaning of life or Mary. All the religious references are there. Even the robust rejection of everything to do with faith over recent years, I refer to books like Richard Dawkins' book, The God Delusion, cannot escape itself being almost zealously devoted to a heartfelt cause on religion, with less missionary atheism requiring no such Pauline urgency, itself to be fulfillingly spiritual. I think here of a South African rock band with a very rude name, Fokhof Polisikar, which means go away police car, but a very rude language, who when they put together their top 12 songs, 12 most popular songs after 10 years in the music industry, there were 11 of them were anti-religious. Very popular music, very good music. It sounds to me as if there's a lot of religion involved to that. Why did I say have again shown us? In all of these cases, what was shown was not finding something new. As historians of the human condition, these theoreticians that I mentioned, Foucault, Marx, Freud, pointed out what had in reality always been there, but had been overlooked, forgotten, or suppressed. The New Testament conversion metaphor of scales falling from the eyes is not out of place here. We learn from these theoreticians to see ourselves better as we are. But in everything, none of these diagnoses of the human condition settled on pointing to one aspect or a few of who we are, letting the rest in peace. Each of these analyses redefined us in our entirety, changing through revealing insight everything there is about what it means to be human, changing that. Even for those who might reject these enlightening intellectuals, our shared self-concepts have been reconstituted to a different whole. If you come across Western culture, you are touched by these figures. You may never have read a word of Freud, but it's in your head. What lay hidden was unmasked by these figures, disturbing as the analysis may be to our psyches when our veils are lifted. The same again now, as we have to make peace with it again, that there is spirituality in everything. No two ways about it. and favorite childhood expression. Spirituality then is the impulses of faith or on faith, which can also be a-religious or anti-religious, but these impulses that work in on us throughout our lives in different ways and from different sources. You can speak theologically about it from the Holy Spirit, you can speak psychologically about it from influence of parents, etc. Also, spirituality is the way that these are transformationally at work, our agency within us. And then the manner in which we give expression to these matters, in what we say, do, and think, and in what we do not say, do, and think. If there is time later, I can give a concrete example of that. Broadly, three ways are found in which spirituality is spoken of in our time. First, popularly, in, for instance, glossy journalism, and in the always recurring well-being, resilience, flourishing, mindfulness conversations on the internet, in bars and elsewhere, that the "I'm spiritual, not religious" slogan resonates well. In all of these places, spirituality is light, positively unstructured, meaningful, but in an easy way. Even though academic studies have been undertaken, dissertations written on, for instance, what lies behind this catchphrase, where this is the going talk, there is no real room in such spirituality for existential angst, for intellectual wrangling on difficult questions. Spirituality simply is, and it is, cool. Then second, I call the anthropological mode, and I don't use the word anthropology as theologians use it, I use it as it's used in the humanities. Especially when in the early history of our species, evidence of a sense of the above human is found on, for instance, rock art here in Southern Africa, or the cave paintings in France, Spain, and in China, that may be labeled spirituality. It's often called that. This is meant to indicate a kind of early pre-religious awareness of something symbolic. But with no further evidence, not much more can be said from those remains about their creators, our ancestors. Something akin to this is found in the modern world, also when the institutional life of the church is spoken of as negatively as religion, with actively caring faith then cast over against that, positively as spirituality. And then in theological circles, despite some methodological variance, the overarching approach is phenomenological. It's the same three aspects that I described in the italicized description above. How God is experienced or sensed, how that alters people, and how that then influences the world. That is the spiritual. To distinguish which of these ways are of referring to spirituality one encounters in each instance requires charitable reading or listening in order to understand what really do we have here in front of us. When it comes to solid academic reading, the strongly increasing body of writings can seem overwhelming, not to speak of the popular writing, because there it is really a veritable flood and much of it is not worth reading. Hence, in what follows, page of it, a brief guide of good places to start. The two academic classics, and there are such classics that they are past their copyright life. So on quite a few websites, you can download these texts for free. And so we're not used to books printed in that way anymore. I mean, that kind of use of printing technique, etc. But it's still interesting to read. Rudolf Otto's highly influential, first, not in 1017, I said here as I typed, but in 1917, Das Heilige, which became highly influential and played to this day a role in academic theology, which was then a few years later translated into English as the idea of the holy. And then slightly before that, William James's series of lectures in Scotland, which was published in 1902, I refer to the 2002 re-edition by Pennsylvania State University, with the title, The Varieties of Religious Experience. You can already see here the kind of things that are at play of the religion, not playing the game of normal rationality, but not that it is irrational, but a different kind of rationality. And one of the basic aspects of religion is experience over against simply knowing or simply doing. The two best current academic entry points are an article and a veritable tome, really a thick book, both hugely valuable to enter into spirituality studies. The first I refer to is by my former colleague at my previous university, Celia Kuri, an article of about 15 pages, Spirituality and the University, which gives an excellent overview of spirituality, what it means, different methodological approaches, and the possibilities that it provides for study. And then the doyen of spirituality studies, Kees Weiman, at the Radboud University in Nijmegen in the Netherlands, published at the beginning of this millennium, his Spiritualiteit, Vormen, Grondslag en Patronen, which was translated 2 years later in English and is now available in German, Spanish, and a few other languages as well. As I say, a veritable tome of a book, and a source beyond any other. There's no work remotely approaching its quality, the depth of study, the care in formulation. It is only somebody who spent a lifetime as a Catholic priest with the church taking care of you that you can write that quality of work. So that is the one that I recommend. The English one for most, because probably the Dutch is not accessible for many readers. These books as a beginning to read, but then again, in spirituality, we are always absolute beginners. David Bowie reference, for those of you who remember music of the 80s. And then I opened up with a little musical notation, then I end with not a grand finale, but an ungrand finale. The argument of this presentation may have veered a little, but the outline is simple. Spirituality is difficult to talk about because it is so close to us. Spirituality is more or less everywhere, working in on us, working in us, and working from us. Central aspects related to spirituality are the experience of faith, and that includes a-religious and anti-religious faith, which then also means that spirituality is transformational. It means change. It means we change, and it means it both senses. We change, we alter, we become changed, but also we change what is around us. Spirituality simply does that naturally. Also, there are different ways spirituality is spoken of, and then there is much to read. These are the basics of our spirituality, which is basic to our constitution as human beings. Thank you. I think I kept more or less to my time.
Yes, you did. Thank you very much. Thank you for giving the time, but of course, thank you very much for a very interesting lecture. Thank you, Kristo. And yes, we can applaud you.
There's a button to press.
So yes, now the floor is open for discussion. So please, everyone who wants to ask something or have might be some very different idea about spirituality, as Kristo does, is very welcome to put the questions in either into chat or just switch on the microphone and speak away. So please.
The Kees Weiman that I spoke of that works in Nijmegen, he has a colleague that works, as do I, on biblical spirituality, Huub Welsen. I see he joined us as well. Very welcome from Nijmegen. and more colleagues from the USA. That's fantastic.
That's great. Yes, I see. Polos is also has joined us. Yes,
Reese is here.
That's great. So if nobody else, or I will start then with my questions. First of all, I just thought, how would you describe the relationship between the individual spirituality and the community? Right. And of course, it is. If you say it is very hard to speak about spirituality, then of course, if we think about community, any kind of community, it needs communication. So it needs this language, and yes, what to do about that? How would you say also what is more important, this individual, the community, or please?
That question is important for two reasons. Number one, that the rational Western culture, which has influenced all of us, works very much with individualism, my personal rights rather than group thinking. And also these newer formulations on religion are spiritual but not religious, also always works with an intensely personal sense. What other people do is almost not important, not regarded as important. But both of those are, of course, false. Let me formulate it this way. Spirituality is always 100% individual, but also 100% communal. There's no way to put these things apart. That doesn't mean that one's own agency, your own processes falls away. But let me explain it a little bit. That none of us grow up in isolation, some kind of island where we see nobody, that we have no impulses about religion that we encounter. Even if we did, we could still probably have some kind of sense of, beautiful scene or something, some elevating experience. But all of us have this idea that people tell you, convey to you, often explicitly, but much more powerfully, implicitly, what is a good way to practice faith or to practice non-faith. I have 10,000 things to say about that at the moment, but let me just say that. So there's no way that one can say that my faith, my spirituality is me and nothing to do with the rest. You may decide that at age 25 you now isolate from any other group activities. In fact, there's a movement of such people in the Netherlands, for instance, who call themselves unaffiliated. And they do not join the movement of unaffiliated people because, of course, then they are affiliated. They are simply unaffiliated. So that kind of thing exists. But even if you are an extreme individualist, if you live in a city that allows you to be an extreme individualist, even then you have to acknowledge that at least you live in a society that allows you to be an individualist. In many traditional societies, there's simply no room for that. You would not survive that way. So that, on the one hand, you can be completely individualist, but in fact you are not. On the other hand, is spirituality only a group thing? Of course, yes, in some respects, yes. And there's a very good example of that from your part of the world, Dace. When Lithuania was a very big country, it wanted to be recognized as a country, and then, but it wasn't. And in order to be recognized as a country, the emperor had to go to the Pope, and the Pope had to recognize that Lithuania is in fact a country. And the Pope said, that's fine, but you have to become Catholic. And then the emperor said, then we are Catholic. And he went back to Lithuania and said, we are Catholic. And to this day, in some respects, they are. That's a communal kind of thinking, which is impossible for modern individualist people. Even if we say, and this is always church talk, that the community is important, being together is important, church life is important. Even if we say that, all of us stand after the Aufklärung, after the Enlightenment, where your own thoughts, your own opinion, you cannot escape from that. Even if you function in a highly pietous small circle, then even then, your personal conversion, your personal relationship with the Lord. You can hear that evangelical language that I quote now. Is highly important. So the personal then never disappears. And even if one doesn't move in such pietist circles, if one moves in a broad group, you are then always, in some ways, the beneficiary of the group, in some ways, the victim of the group, and vice versa. So it cannot be the one or the other. It's always 100% both.
Okay.
It's a recurring debate in spirituality studies.
Yeah, thank you. So we have now 2 questions in the chat, and I will take the first one and read it. So Kristo, thank you for the talk, Kristo. This Elmo writing. You referred to bad spirituality in brief. Can you perhaps give an example? Yes.
Elmer is from Johannesburg, also writing a doctorate on leadership and spirituality. Bad spirituality is spirituality which is superficial on the one hand, which harms people on the other hand, and which drives people away from both themselves and community. Let me give an example. I'll give an extreme example. That if you live in a kind of a religious community where human sacrifice is part of the activities every once in a while, clearly there's no way you can speak that positively about that. You may ooh and ah about the elevating experience for those who witness the event, but of course for the one who is the person on the altar, that is certainly no positive experience. Less dramatically, it is clear that spiritualities which denigrate a gender or denigrate a racial group or denigrate people from a socio-economic standing is certainly not healthy. It's certainly not affirming. It is exclusive rather than inclusive. Spirituality always has this thing of being inclusive. And they're not only inclusive of people who are like us. There's always this kind of a reflex that I'm inclusive of anybody, but they have to be like me, not like that. And open, affirming inclusivity. Then you have good spirituality. I have great problems, for instance, with the mighty men movement, because it is mighty men. First of all, the mighty word doesn't work well for me, and only men. The paternalism that is implied by that. We have a version of that in South Africa as well. I wrote on a literary website, not an academic piece, but a very playful commentary piece pointing out the problem of this. And I was told not to go and look at the comments because they were quite crude, thus proving the point that this is certainly not healthy spirituality, not positive spirituality.
Okay. So now we have some more questions, and I will ask away. Lauma Lappa writes, may I ask, why do the people make such a great distinction between being religious and being spiritual? Sometimes think that I sometimes think that people make such assertions to sound more fashionable, and that is that. How does spirituality of our day connect to mysticism?
There's 2 questions. I agree with you completely that to say something is spiritual but not religious is as nonsensical as saying something is religious but not spiritual. The link between the two is intimate. It's conceptual differences, not actual differences. It's a little bit like speaking of Freud's ego and superego. Then you would say, so the id is there and the superego is there. It doesn't work. It's concepts. There's no actual differentiation between it. When people say this, I'm spiritual but not religious, I think what they mean by it is that they may have had bad experiences in church, but they have not lost the sense of faith that somehow God or religion or being in touch with the above human is important for them. I used to have a music hobby, and then I would often end up in bars, late night conversations. Then you would meet many people who would say that. And what was surprising to me is that if they say I'm spiritual but not religious, it meant bad experience with the church. But then of the church 15 or 20 years ago, it's no longer the church. And also then the Jesus figure would be very important somehow, often along with Buddha combined. But the way that they would speak about Jesus would be a very pious Jesus, a very, very pious Jesus. Not the historical Jesus, not the Jesus of the church 20 years later. That Jesus, the Jesus talk in the church has changed. It's a kind of a slogan, I think, for people who have withdrawn from formalized religion, but do not want to let this go. And do not want to let this go is something positive, because clearly there's some searching or some sense of the divine. Some people perhaps because it simply seems cool or the thing to do. You don't want to be shallow, so therefore I'm spiritual. But I think for many people there's something, some connection. The relationship between spirituality and mysticism. The best way to describe mysticism is as spiritual peak experiences, which are more common than we realize. More people have it than we realize, but as with the classical mystical figures through the ages, and as with them, it's the same now. The people do not speak about it because it is such a earth-shattering experience, this experience that you have a concrete contact with the divine. That if you would tell that to people, they would look strangely at you, may refer you to a psychologist or psychiatrist. Not that there's anything wrong with either of those two, but the common sense is that if you have such a direct encounter with God, something must be wrong with you. Maybe even a chemical short circuit inside your mind or inside your body. So the common understanding of mysticism is not something entirely affirming, but in spirituality studies, we take mysticism very seriously as these rare figures who have such an encounter often withdraw for months or for years from society. If they live in some cloistered community as monks or as nuns, they would withdraw in their room. And in such communities, they'll often be allowed the freedom to do so. In some societies, such figures can become highly influential after the period of isolation. They could start writing, start speaking in public, and then are consulted in ways that we would never do today. What is interesting when for instance, some of the nuns in the Middle Ages had these mystical experiences, and then when they started writing about it, they often wrote in poetic language, and often in erotic language, which for nuns is rather strange, not the poetry, but the erotic language. And in both cases, I think it's for the same reason that both poetry and eroticism takes you beyond yourself. Poetry, by definition, is not literal meaning. And eroticism, by definition, is the experience that feels it is beyond you. So they write erotic poetry in order to convey something of the divine, of the experience that they had. I'll give an example of how different societies relate differently to this. In our society, if I had a mystical experience and I then put myself on top of a 6-foot pole or an 8-foot pole and I lived there for 20 years, I wouldn't live there for 20 years. Within 2 or 3 days, people would send the police, would take me down and would be institutionalized and would be given medication. Yet, in 5th century Syria, for instance, Simeon was a very well-known such a mystic who lived on such a pillar for many years with a wall built around it so that you could see almost nobody, but those who could see were only men, not even his own mother was allowed. And people traveled from far and wide, including political leaders, to consult him for his wisdom, because he had this mystical experience. Now he is on the pillar, and now that's something special. So different societies relate to this quite differently. In our society, such a person would not be appreciated. In all the societies, something special.
Thank you. So we can continue with questions in chat. Melissa Duplace asks, where on the communal individualistic spectrum would you say that uniqueness lay, if any? And I hate to ask you answer a bit shorter. So we can manage also the other questions as well. But please, yes.
Anyway, uniqueness is per definition, there's only one of it. I mean, that's the meaning of the word uniqueness. I know people speak of something is more unique or really unique, which doesn't make sense. Unique means there's only one. If you mean by that, can you have an authentic spiritual experience which is only you, which is not derivative of others? Certainly. In fact, everybody has that, whether you acknowledge it or not. None of us are carbon copies or photocopies of each other's spiritualities. Even if it's somebody we admire, if it's somebody that we live close by, even if it's somebody who had dominant influence on our lives, you are always religious or non-religious in your own way. It's always unique. But all of us are unique together, so.
That's okay.
Sure.
Yvette Greifrat asks, I live in a society, USA, where there doesn't seem to be much time to either practice or contemplate spirituality. So how do we construct an environment with spirituality inherently part of it? Right. That involve moving to Alaska. I guess this speaks more to the degradation of spirituality, religion in the dominant culture over here.
Right. Yvette, I think you used the word spirituality the way it is used when people say, I feel my life is hollow or empty or meaningless, and therefore I go and I explore something that would give me meaning, which often means period of isolation, certain rituals, certain readings, trying thought experiments such as a mantra, which could be a Bible verse that you say, or a meaningful phrase that you repeat in order to focus your life, in order to get a greater sense of yourself and of your relationship with the world, with the divine, of people around you. I think that's what you mean by it. And that kind of thing, you're quite right. In both South African society and in the US society, that is not well appreciated because both are work cultures, inherently Calvinistic. If in such a culture, if you tell somebody sits for 3 minutes in silence, you can see the suffering halfway through. If you tell them, okay, that will be 3 hours or 3 months, it becomes impossible. In fact, it would even be described as a sin because you should be working as part of your normal life tasks, also as a religious expression, you should be working. Yet, if one speaks to a Catholic and say, you will now go on a 3-month silence retreat, the answer is, okay. There's no shock in it. So there's something with the culture that appreciates certain expressions of spirituality. So that is the word that you use, the word spirituality. The way I use it is slightly different, that everything we do is spirituality. And I can give examples, but it will take too long. It is impossible to do something that is not filled in all kinds of ways, by implication or in my history or where the idea originally comes from, with some form of religious impulse, some form of religious parallel, which if I see it, gives it greater meaning. If I don't see it, I may experience my life as meaningless. But if I do see it, the French existentialists did that in a rather interesting way. But okay, that's another 20 minutes discussion there.
We would have also some question about that here, but I think we have to move on with questions already put here. June Boyce-Tillman from UK asks, how far has the denial in Christian circles of apophatic theology and its concern for preaching cataphatic theology led to the fracturing of religion and spirituality?
Right. What June refers to is traditionally these two ways of practicing theology. The one is you can call positive theology. So you have to know what you believe, you have to be able to say what you believe, and then you do it. And then there's what is called the via negativa, which means that it is impossible to say what God is. It is impossible to say why and how I believe. It is impossible to give adequate expression to my sense of being in the world, my sense of God. And it's this kind of via negativa, which is not negative, which is in fact highly positive, which is not appreciated in church circles. Often mystics go for that kind of thing. In fact, naturally are drawn towards it. Because if you have a clear sense of the divine, now if you have an unclear sense of the divine, that you realize it is so real, but so different, so impossible to say, you are driven to silence. Hence that opening line of mine right at the beginning, that proper spirituality is silence. And that is often described as a more spiritual way of living. Of course, it is true that it is a spiritual way of living. I have difficulty with calling it more because it's different, certainly. It is certainly not the dominant form, but both are valid forms of expression. And I can understand both from the outside and from the inside a little bit, because I grew up Calvinist and Afrikaans, which is can-do cultures. You have to do, you have to know, you have to say. And through my studies of spirituality, it's exactly the opposite. So it's different forms of spirituality, different forms of being.
Okay. There was another question actually from June as well, might be it's connected. Is the mystical experience not part of normal human experience, but blotted out by the Enlightenment?
Exactly that. Yes. You cannot explain this rationally, so therefore you do not speak about it, because what will rational people say about it? Because I live in Africa, we all know these stories. Stories are written up in academic books as well, of things that make no sense to the Western mind. I remember one textbook that I studied in this very faculty some years ago about a small rural village of people living a traditional life. And there was a story spread about the young teenage girl who got in the bowl in which the washing up was done. And at night she would get on it and fly around. I say that in a rational Western society, there's somebody has to be diagnosed and there must be medication, and possibly the police will be involved. But in such a world which is not the Western rationalism, not the Enlightenment world, it is handled a completely different way. Talks in the community about relationships which are not what they should be, all kinds of underlying tensions. And then suddenly the story spreads that the girl is no longer flying in the world. The problem has been solved. For Western rationality, that's impossible to understand. But one of the great things of living in Africa, in South Africa, we have the West fully, we have the Africa fully, and we sense the difference.
Okay. And here, the last question in the chat so far, what would you say about people where spirituality seems to have been excised, like they have been broken, as if all the light globes in sequence don't light up?
If you mean by that people really have no spirituality, that would be difficult for me to understand. If you mean by that, which I think you mean, is that people have given up on spirituality. That I think I've bashed my head against too many walls. I had problems with the church. God doesn't make sense. I suffer. My loved ones may have passed away without any good reason, and now I have nothing. Then certainly I can experience that. I can understand that people experience that as the spiritual light going out. But that is only because our expectations, now I shouldn't use the word only, that is because our expectations are for a good life. A good God would give us certain things. A God that loves us would not let us suffer. And that is a rather modern thing and a rather Western thing over the past 200 years or so. If you take, for instance, the book of Ecclesiastes in the Old Testament, where you can put the good and the bad next to each other, and God gives the good and God gives the bad. God gives death and God gives the party with the friends and the wine and the love. It's a different way of thinking about this. Very difficult to get out of this expectation, because it's a very powerful expectation. I mean, we train ourselves in the West. We should not have pain. We should not suffer. We should not die early. All of these things are strong ideals that we live by. And the moment something goes against that, then we say, but why does a loving God do this? So we have forgotten about the holiness life in order to live this pain-free, trouble-free life, and then experiencing that as God. And with the theologies that emphasize success, I'm afraid they go for that rather fully.
Thank you. Is there somebody who wanted to ask something but couldn't write the questions? So please switch on your microphone and ask away, as I said before. If not, then I squeeze my own question as the last one. Somebody writes to me that there is another question, but I'm still waiting for that. But then I squeeze my question. So I love actually this interpretation. Spirituality is everything. So it gives me the feeling of the opportunity to see the spirituality, whatever I do, hear, think. But you said also that that we don't see it sometimes. That we have that our eyes, like in New Testament, is covered, or we don't see. We are blind. What makes us to see?
Let me give you an example. How often people think spirituality is esoteric. It's something touchy-feely, vague, but it's in fact highly concrete. Here's the example. If you grew up in a Christian country or in a Christian environment, then the story of the Good Samaritan has been drilled into you from when you were very small. You understand the parable of Jesus very well, and you understand that there's all kinds of things at play there, namely that Jesus, a Jew, uses a Samaritan, his enemy, as the hero of his story, who then helps his enemy, another Jew. So there's all kinds of caring going on there. And you know that it is your religious duty that and your personal duty that if you see somebody suffering, you have to help. If you walk past the park and there's somebody lying, suffering or dying, and you do not help them, you cannot help yourself. If you have these impulses working on yourself, now you've worked through them, you cannot help yourself but to help that person. So you give expression, the ideas, the impulses from the Good Samaritan story, you've processed, and now you have to do something. If you do not do something, you decide to walk away, then you know you are one of those three men who passed by the person who was attacked. And for the rest of your life, you feel guilty. So that is if you grow up in the context of Christianity. If you grow up in the context of reincarnation, say in traditional India, it is exactly the opposite. There, the idea is that you live this life, and if you do bad things, then next life you will suffer. If in this life you suffer, that means in your previous life you did something bad. If your life is good here, then you know previous life you did good things. Now you walk through the park, and there, same scenario, there lies somebody suffering. Now you know if that person suffering must have done something good, something bad in the previous life. That is why they are suffering here. So you walk away and you feel good about yourself because you are helping that person so that he suffers now and dies, and his next life will be much easier because he's suffering now. If I do go and decide, okay, I will go and help him, then for the rest of my life, I feel bad because now this guy didn't suffer enough. His next life, he will have to come back and suffer again, and I caused that. So here is very concrete example, a little bit extreme, but it illustrates the point that the spiritual impulses that you pick up the whole time, unknowingly, and you process it, you understand yourself that this is what being good means, and you know what being bad means. And it has direct implications to what you do. So there's a good example to illustrate what spirituality really is.
Okay, thank you. I have to admit that I missed one of the questions, and please, I ask you for patience. We could still do two questions and then finish for tonight. So the question from Ignatius Swart, and I apologize to all of you for pronunciation of your names if I don't do it correctly, but I try my best. So here the question is, do you see a role for practical theology in spirituality studies, and what could it entail?
Colleague Swart from 1,300 kilometers south of me in Cape Town, he asked a very clever question because he knows I moved 3 months ago from a Christian spirituality appointment at the University of South Africa to a practical theology appointment University of Pretoria. And I think what lies behind this question is, will I continue with spirituality? Of course, yes. Spirituality has the advantage that it falls rather well within quite a few disciplines. In fact, formally inside this university, spirituality falls under systematic theology, simply formally for the arrangement, with the appointment that have been made earlier. And my previous appointment, spirituality was placed with church history and missiology. At the moment, I'm in a practical theology and missiology department, and spirituality, along with a few other things, remains my field of study. So do I say different things? Well, to the students, certainly, because the students ask different questions in the subject. But will my research tack change? Maybe a little bit. I haven't really considered that. Mainly because my research has fallen behind, moving to the new university.
Okay. So now, and this will be the last question. Do you know of someone who ever combined Lakoff and Johnson's conceptual metaphor theory to look at ways people speak of embodied spiritual experiences and root metaphors at play? It would be interesting to compare early Christian texts with our Western experience and also with experiences of indigenous Africans.
Kobus Kok writes from Leuven in Belgium. I used to be in this very same faculty where I am now, and we exchange emails and conferences rather regularly. Kobus, I know of Lakoff and Johnson via you. I've never read it. I've only heard you speak about it when we had informal discussions. So I cannot say much about that. But to compare early Christian texts with our Western experience and compare that with how indigenous African people or any indigenous people react to the text, certainly it will be interesting. What I can guarantee you is there will be huge differences in how the texts are experienced, what is seen in the text, and what the texts are meant to be or thought to imply for our lives. I can give some concrete examples of how it is in fact not always the opposite. Sometimes the one feeds into the other, but the examples may take us beyond time. Perhaps I can give one example, if I could. Okay, let me give one example. In not too far from where I grew up is a town called Colenso, a very small town, named after John William Colenso, who was an Anglican missionary amongst the Zulus. So he arrived from England, the idea to convert Zulu people to Christianity. And his life experience taught us that often when we think people should be different, in fact, they help each other. Namely, as a very pious missionary, he told the Zulu people that, for instance, the story about the exodus from Egypt to the Promised Land. And the Zulu men, this is after he learned Zulu, so he could do it in Zulu. And the Zulu men, having been warriors, knew very well how troops of people move. So listening to the story, they told him that this is not true, the Exodus story. And he said, what do you mean the Bible is not true? He said, well, the Zulu men explained to him, with such numbers as you have there, the first people who were walking would already have arrived in the Promised Land, and the last people would not have left Egypt yet. Those numbers can't be real. They must be symbolic, because the Zulu men understand how to move troops across the lands of KwaZulu-Natal area. Clearly, Colenso was surprised by this, started thinking about it, started writing books, published a series of commentaries on Pentateuch theory, how the Pentateuch came into being, which to this day is taken seriously in academic life. It's not a major figure anymore. His books are too old for that, but certainly still taken seriously, still read. And there's an example of, even though despite different worldviews, that often the one can help the other. So in fact, here Zulu men from quite a traditional worldview help the Westerner with his rationalist worldview to read the Bible written in a non-rationalist worldview to understand it better.
Thank you. Now, there is still another question in the chat, and I will just ask you not to write anymore. So I cannot say no to the questions which are put in the chat. So if you, Kristo, are still ready to answer one more question, then this will be the last one. So this is question from Matthias Höhne. And he asks, what do you think about the statement from Brother Lawrence? And here is a quotation from Brother Lawrence. Okay, I read it quickly. We look for. Excuse me?
I read it now while you were.
You already read it now, and I hope everyone else can see it, so you can probably answer right away. So
the base of the question is, the basic thing of the question is, does methodology help us to come closer to God, or is the direct experience of God more authentic? Certainly the latter. Is there ever anything such as a completely direct experience of God? I think so with the mystics. Most of it have it mediated. How do we have it mediated? Well, perhaps because through some sense of revelation that God speaks to me, either directly, but not dramatically, or through other people, or through sermons, or through the Bible, or through Bible study, or through nature, or through art, the normal experience of revelation. Or for many other people, it is, no, if you're a Calvinist especially, no, I get to understand God best through the Bible. So then you have these two competing ways of understanding how does this relationship, this direct relationship with God work best. And that we find already in the Old Testament, competing views of where do you find God most directly. With the Mosaic books, via writing. With the prophetic books, via direct revelation. With the Western books, from society, the insights that we've gained over centuries. So these are questions that have been with us for as long as we know, won't disappear, and are always important. Thank you for raising it.
Thank you very much, Kristo, for this, first of all, very interesting lecture and very competent answers and inspiring, and for these impulses you gave us all tonight. And yes, I hope we will meet in similar events in the future as well. That would be, yes, would be very nice. And thanks to all of you who participated tonight, to listen and listened and yes, consider it a bit theologically tonight. So thank you to everyone. And yes, have a good night tonight, and let us meet again.
And my thanks to everybody who attended, everybody who made the arrangement. I appreciate this so very much. It's so good to see you on camera as well. It's some of us have seen each other for years. Some of us have never seen each other at all.
Thank you very much, Kristo.
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay. Bye.